Hello, and welcome to the Money Marketing Podcast. I'm Chief Reporter Lois, and I'm delighted to introduce the first episode in a three-part series brought to you in association with Quilter, looking at how advisors can adapt their advice for ESG. With regulators placing ever greater scrutiny on ESG, this episode looks at what this means for advisors and how they can stay ahead of the curve.
Hello, I'm Lois, Chief Reporter for Money Marketing. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a podcast series that we're doing with Quilter, which will explore how advisors should be adapting their advice in line with ESG. So today I'm joined by Andy Miller, who's an investment specialist at Quilter. Andy, could I start by asking you to introduce yourself to our listeners, say a bit about yourself, and also why you feel ESG is such an important topic?
Yeah, of course. And thank you very much for having me today, Lois. I appreciate the time. So, as you've said, my name is Andy Miller. I'm an investment specialist with Quilter. My role is to help advisors from an investment perspective. So, in particular, when they're putting together investment processes and investment advice. And increasingly, one of the areas that we've been looking at very closely at Quilter with our desire to be a leader in responsible investment is the concept of ESG and how you factor that into advice as you provide advice to a client. The reason why that is increasingly important just now is that twofold, really. Well, ESG, at its core, ESG is environmental, social, and governance criteria. So 3 different areas, but all used to screen investments by an investment manager. And they screen investments in such a way as to identify certain key risks and indeed potentially to encourage companies that they're investing in to act in a responsible manner. So that's it from an investment management perspective, but also what we are finding is there is a big drive by investors and by clients to invest in line with their values. They may have particular values with regards to the environment. They may have particular values with regards to the way that society is treated, and they wish to invest in line with these values. And the last thing is what we've seen is a big drive from the regulator, our regulator, and indeed regulators globally towards investing in an ESG way, in an ESG manner.
Great. So I think, in this episode, regulation is what we're going to be focusing on. So thanks for mentioning regulation there. What are some of the ways that you're seeing it change in relation to ESG?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really big question. And I think if you're thinking about how regulation is changing, the first way to think about it is to think about it in a global context. And the reason to think about it in a global context is that our government in the UK, but other governments around the world have made really strong environmental commitments at summits such as COP26, which was held recently in my hometown of Glasgow. And the commitments that are made in these areas drive government policy, and that government policy then drives legislation, and legislation ultimately drives regulation. So what you've got is a combination of global and EU and UK regulation and initiatives, and those are very quickly and rapidly changing the landscape around us in all sorts of ways, but in particular around financial services. And the reason that it's affecting financial services in particular is that the financial sector has been recognised as having an especially strong influence when it comes to delivering global and domestic climate and environmental objectives. So if we think globally first, well, there's initiatives from the UN, such as the Principles for Responsible Investment. And the Principles for Responsible Investment are principles for how investment managers incorporate ESG issues into their investment practices. And increasingly what we're seeing within the UK is that many investment managers, indeed I will go so far as to say as the majority of investment managers, are now signatories to the UNPRI. There are also other engagements, other initiatives, such as the UN Global Compact, which is a principles-based approach to business practice, so looking at specific companies and businesses and how they behave in relation to human rights and labour and environment and so on. The last one from the UN is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a framework of 17 different sustainable development goals designed to allow you and me and companies and governments to balance outcomes of social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So in other words, how we should all behave to make the world a more sustainable place environmentally and for people as well. So that's at UN level. So there's lots of things going on globally. These things then affect how our governments behave, our own government policy, and they then affect our own regulation that we're faced with when we're giving investment advice. It's also worth looking at what's going on in the EU. The EU is a little bit ahead of us in terms of regulation in this area, and that may well be a strong indicator of the direction of travel from our own regulator.
Okay, and has that changed in relation to Brexit? Is that is that any different for Brexit?
It's an excellent question because clearly EU regulation is not binding on us post-Brexit. So if the EU introduce particular pieces of financial regulation, it is non-binding, and we need to be clear on that. But what we have seen in relation to what has gone on so far is that our own regulator has essentially said, look, we're looking very closely at regulation elsewhere. And indeed, some of the regulation that we've seen being introduced in the UK is a very close copy of regulation that's going on in the European Union just now. So, for example, there's a discussion paper at the moment within the UK on sustainability disclosure requirements, and you're seeing some strong similarities between this paper on sustainability disclosure requirements and a piece of legislation in the EU called the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Requirements. So some strong similarities there. And that's really quite intentional. Our regulator in the UK has effectively said that they want to recognise regulation that's going on within the EU, and they're probably only going to really differ from it if there's a strong reason to do so in terms of the domestic UK market. So yes, it's certainly changed post-Brexit in relation to the fact that it's non-binding, but at the same time, it's a very strong indicator of the direction in which we're going just now.
Okay, that's interesting. So how should advisors react to this? What are some of the key UK pieces of regulation that they should be aware of, and how is it going to affect them going forward?
Okay, that's a really good question. So what are the key pieces of UK regulation? So I mentioned that paper a moment ago, the discussion paper, which will shortly be released as a consultation paper and then will be issued as finalised guidance. Now, that is a paper called the Sustainability Disclosure Requirements and Investment Labels, so catchy title. And the idea there is really to help advisors and indeed help underlying clients identify exactly what they're investing in. And the way that they identify what they're investing in is by having three different fund labels, three different broad headings that will apply to all funds. The first one is a fund that is not promoted as having any sustainable characteristics whatsoever, and that may be the broad sweep of funds just now. The next is called responsible, so that's the middle one, if you like, and that will have some ESG characteristics. And then at the top end, funds will be labelled as sustainable, and there's three further subcategories, and that would have the highest level of sustainability characteristics. So if I'm an advisor in the UK just now, I think it's very well worth being aware of this, because this is how funds are going to be characterised and how they're going to be labelled in the future. Now, to be clear, to be crystal clear here, that is something that applies to investment managers. It's not aimed at financial advisors. But in that paper, it does specifically note that, and I'm quoting here from the paper, building on existing rules, a key aim will be to confirm, so that's to confirm that advisors should take sustainability matters into account in their investment advice and understand investors' preferences on sustainability to ensure their advice is suitable. So there is an expectation now, at this moment in time, that advisors are taking into account sustainability preferences when they give investment advice.
Okay, that's interesting. So at quite a few of our events, we have, especially some of the older advisors, say to us, well, ESG, our clients don't really ask us about ESG, so it's clearly not of interest to them. So what would you say to those advisors?
So what you would probably find is so the question is not really our clients don't ask us for it, because the point of financial advice is really about finding out what your clients' needs and preferences are, and then finding an investment that is suitable for those needs and preferences. And it's not just that a client comes and asks you for it. Are you asking your clients about it, would be my question. And you may find for the vast majority of your clients, they may well say that they have no interest in it, but you need to have some kind of process in place to document the fact you've had this conversation, to document whether they do or do not have interest in this area, and then find an appropriate investment off the back of that. And again, this is something that the regulator has said. They've said that ESG is already in scope when advisors give investment advice. And as again, I'm going to quote from Mark Manning from the FCA, and he said, under existing rules, firms have to collect all necessary information to understand the client's investment objectives. In that context, the context of sustainability, that we already require the consideration of ESG preferences. So if you're waiting for a client to ask you about it, as opposed to the other way around, you can't really demonstrate that you collected the necessary information in this area.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's as somebody else at the event that I mentioned said, clients might not necessarily ask you about VCTs either, but it doesn't mean that they don't need to know about them.
It's a very good point, yeah.
Yeah, also, they might not know what ESG means, but they might care about responsible investing. So, yeah, as you say, very much on the advisor to give you advice, I think.
Yeah, that's correct. And just when you're collecting suitability information on your clients generally, you don't sit and wait for the client to tell you what they want. So if you're looking at risk profiling, exactly, for example, you don't sit and wait for the client to tell you what risk profile they are. You engage with the client in an appropriate way, and that may well be by asking them a series of questions around risk to ask them, well, listen, what is the appropriate level of risk to invest you at? So it could be a 1 to 10 or a 1 to 5 or whatever it is, but it's not reactive. You are proactively exploring that with the client. And because ESG, sustainability, it's a thing. It's a thing the client may have an interest in. Now, they may well not, but you need to explore it with them. That's the key point.
Yeah, definitely. So are there additional risks that advisors need to be aware of in relation to these latest regulatory changes?
There are. There's always risks in association to regulatory changes. I guess the core here is really around suitability. That's the core of advice. And what suitability is proposing something that's appropriate for a client's needs and their preferences. So as long as you can demonstrate that you're managing suitability, then you're managing any risks to your advice. And what that means is really understanding two things. Now, first of all, do your clients have views in this area, and what are those views? And if they do have views in this area, well, to what extent do they want that to influence their investment decisions? And to be clear on this, a client may have strong views on the environment, they may have strong views on how they want society to be treated, but they may say, look, I don't want that to influence my investments. That's something I view as being separate. And that's okay. That's up to that client. But at the same time, they may have those strong views and they do want them to have some kind of influence on their investment selection. So that's just something you need to explore. And then, so once you've understood that, you understand the client and what their needs are, what their views are, what their preferences are, then having an understanding of the range of investment products from this responsible investing perspective and being able to find the right match for your client. So long as you can do those two things, understand the client, understand the range of investments that are available, and provide a match between the two, well, that is going to manage any risk that exists to your advice.
Great. And in light of all these regulatory changes that are going on then, how do you see the advice process changing from what it is today in the future?
Again, an excellent question. So I think we've seen the advice process over the past 10 years, 15 years, 20 years evolve an awful lot. And this really is just another step in that evolution. Now, anytime there's any kind of change, it can take a little bit of time and it can take a little bit of effort to adapt to it. But once you've done that and once you've adapted, it's just going to become business as usual. And we've seen that with regulatory changes in the past, for example, with RDR, the introduction of MiFID II, and so on. So in terms of your advice process, probably the best thing is to consider how you can easily and quickly adapt your advice and how you can do it with as little pain as possible. Now, Quilter have developed a couple of tools here which we think can help advisors and can help you adapt that advice in that pain-free way. The first is a responsible investment profiler. And that's a short series of questions. And those questions are just designed to help you understand your client's views. Now, we've designed that around UK regulation. It takes a client about 8 minutes to complete it. So it's pretty straightforward and it's pretty easy to adapt that into your advice process. The second tool is designed to help you explore our investment solutions fully. So not just in terms of risk level, costs and so on, but also from a responsible investment perspective. And that's designed to help you find the right match for your client's needs quickly and easily. So I guess what we're going to see is if we were to rewind the clock, maybe 15 years, most advisors probably didn't go through a formalized risk profiling process. Now, the vast majority of them do, and the vast majority of them use a risk profiler of some sort. I think the way that we'll see this adapt in the future is we will see the introduction of responsible investment profilers, and we like to think we're ahead of the trend with the introduction of this.
Great. And earlier on in this conversation, you mentioned COP26 and its legacy and how it's sort of affecting regulation. Do you have any sort of crystal ball predictions for what might come out of COP27 in November?
I'm afraid I didn't bring my crystal ball with me. I think COP26 was accompanied by an awful lot of expectations as to, real positive change that would be driven as a result of it. And so, for example, the commitment to phase out the use of coal altogether. And some of these things just didn't happen in quite the way that we expected them to. The point is that as the situation continues and as we continue to see the effects of climate change, these agreements, these principles become more urgent. So while I wouldn't make any specific predictions around COP27, what you would expect is that each of these, you would find that they become more urgent and that the level of commitments made globally become higher. And if those commitments made globally are higher, that has an impact on legislation and ultimately regulation as well. So again, winding it back to the concept of financial advice, future COP summits are, if anything, they are going to increase the urgency of updating your advice and adapting your advice to this new concept of integrating ESG.
Great, very interesting. Thank you very much for talking to me today, Andy. It's been really enjoyable to speak to you about regulation and ESG. Do join us again for our next podcast, which will be all about integrating ESG into the advice journey. So I look forward to that.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed the first episode of the ESG and Advice podcast, brought to you in association with Quilter. To find out more about Wealth Select, Quilter's recently enhanced managed portfolio service, visit the Quilter website. Also, listen out for all episodes in this series and other money marketing podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also keep up to date with all our content on the Money Marketing website, as well as Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening.